Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Fair. I'm the president of Resonance and founder of the World's Best Cities Rankings. I'm pleased to have Parag Khanna joining us today to discuss the world's next best cities. Parag is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based planning and advisory firm. He's the international best-selling author of more than 6 books, including this most recent one called Move. Welcome, Parag. Thanks for joining us.
Great to see you, Chris. Looking forward to our conversation today.
So first off, I wanted to start by just talking about migration and the movement of people and what we've seen happening over the last 18 months. There's been much discussed and anecdotal evidence, and we've seen some early data of people, in fact, leaving some of these superstar cities in large metropolitan areas and in developed economies. In our research on preparing the world's best cities rankings, we look at more than 20 different factors that have historically shown strong correlations with attracting talent, attracting companies, or attracting visitors. But based on our research, as you look at cities in developed economies, there's really one factor that has stood out more than any other, and that's wage growth and economic opportunity, which really explains why we see cities like New York or London or Tokyo or Paris at the top of our rankings each year. Of course, over the last 18 months, we've seen that these cities have been some of the hardest hit by the pandemic, as we saw more people remote working, leaving the offices, moving further afield. What's your kind of take on this shift that we've seen within some of these developed economies? Is this just a temporal shift? I mean, some of these cities were losing population even before the pandemic. What's your view on the role that these superstar cities play and what they might look like in the future?
Well, that's exactly right, Chris. So there was definitely some attrition of population prior to the pandemic, and we should go back and look at the signals and the causes of that, because they tell us a lot about where people will go next. And of course, one of the causes was affordability, right? So even if you're earning that higher salary, that higher wage in a superstar city, your cost of living is also very high. Now, in the post-pandemic world, if you didn't have the acceleration of technology and digitization and the opportunities for remote work and the kind of the new corporate culture in a way that's emerging, that many companies are either aggressively leaning into the way tech companies are, or are grudgingly accepting in the way that some companies in more traditional sectors are. The fact is that people now feel that they want to live where they want to live wherever they want, and continue to receive that high wage salary as if they were still living in a superstar city. And that negotiation is going on right now as we speak, right, in the human resources departments, general counsels, and so forth. And we'll see how it plays out. But by and large, I think that in a tight labor market, the talent is winning, right? The talent is saying, I'm going to live wherever I want. And therefore, those same motivators, right, cost of living, is going to be a factor. And people are going to say, I'm going to move to cheaper places, continue to earn a high salary, and be able to save. So I think that it's not to say that these cities aren't going to regain their appeal, that they aren't going to learn and reinvent and restructure the way New York did after 9/11 and after the financial crisis. Of course, they will in some ways. But I've just brought up one factor, which is remote work, which will change people's calculations about where they want to be. The second is climate change, because, of course, quite a few superstar cities are also located in climate-stressed areas. So we can't answer the question while holding all else equal, right? The pandemic was one thing, but we got to think about the economics, the technology, and climate, and the new circulation, the new patterns that will emerge as individuals who are smart, autonomous agents are actually factoring all of these things in at the same time.
So what does this look like at a global scale as you talk about some of these forces within your new book, Move, and this history of human migration? We can look at, what were the world's best cities 100 years ago were different than 500 years ago to 1,000 years ago. So there has been this current of migration all through human history. And you talk about people seeking out places based on latitude or altitude or attitudes. Maybe let's talk about just the geography of cities, and first and foremost, and what are some of these forces? You mentioned climate change as one of the obvious big currents of change here, but give us a little bit of a snapshot of your thinking here around what are the forces that are affecting human migration at a global level, and what's also the pace of change that, is this over hundreds of years, or is this accelerating in the current environment?
Well, we always have a competition going on between cities, even if you take a landscape where you fixed the number of key global hubs, the desirable metropoles of the world, there's an intense competition among them, whether it's LA, New York, London, Dubai, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so forth. But obviously now you have that evolution to new geographies of growth, new cities that are emerging. They may not yet be superstar cities in the traditional sense of the term, but certainly competitive places that are drawing talent. But let me just back up for 1 second and remind everyone that even if you believe that this de-urbanization trend is a long-term phenomenon, and of course, this being the World City, sort of conference, we don't want to we want to point out that people will gravitate towards urban environments, even if they are smaller than the cities that they've lived in before. So the city does not lose, even if some cities are losing at a certain point of time. New cities are gaining and winning. So cities always win, let's be clear. And that's especially true when you look outside of the West, where no one is talking about de-urbanization. The majority of the human population, of course, lives out here in Asia. And not once during this pandemic have I heard anyone in any Asian country say, because of the pandemic, I'm no longer going to live in or flock to a major developed, pulsing capital of activity, of commerce, and so forth. Because the gap between life in that city and the rest of the country is quite vast in Asian countries. So, don't lose any sleep over the future of urbanization. People are going to continue to move to cities, but we have to make the cities better. So let's talk about those trends that are driving people, right? And I think it's a very healthy trend that people are saying, I want to live in a city that's a 15-minute city, right? Where, everything is accessible within a 15-minute walking radius. Or I'm going to pay really close attention to my 5-block radius. I want to live in a place where there's parks and life and amenities and so forth, and culture and all of that. And I think that's a very good thing. And you can see that the Parises and the Londons are now aspiring to start to look like collections of the smaller, European cities that have been getting this right for a long time. Smaller European capitals, whether it's in Switzerland or Belgium or elsewhere. So I think that we're going to see a lot of evolution in urban planning and design, and that's going to play a big role in the competition of the future to recruit the next generation, young talent that, again, is seeking affordability and lifestyle and remote work and doesn't want to be tied down to long-term rents and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of excited about some of those new models that lie ahead. And of course, the places that are in climate resilient geographies are going to inevitably prevail in the sense that people will voluntarily go there because, of course, if they can afford to and they have the foresight, or involuntarily in the sense that, we're experiencing some pretty dramatic, cataclysmic, really, climate effects. And countries that are climate propitious need to be prepared to absorb people from those that are not.
So when you talk about climate change, and where do you see the climate change being most impacting cities, and who are the winners in this? Is this just a general migration north, or are there different patterns of change that we should be thinking about in terms of these climate oases, as you call them?
When I was writing Move, I sort of thought it would be a linear story of the world population moving from south to north. And as a general vector, it's obviously more south to north than it is north to south. That sort of goes without saying. However, you have these complex effects. When you have a lot of people, sort of flood a place, they can also destabilize it. They can ruin it. You can have the tragedy of the commons, right? And I write about some of those phenomena or concerns. So, if you take a very attractive, very desirable city like Vancouver, right, which is growing very fast, people are, sort of flocking in from all over the world. It's getting overpriced. Toronto, same thing, right? Huge population increase, but the affordable housing, the public infrastructure hasn't really coped. So it's a victim of its own success, in other words. And of course, we want to be careful about preserving the ecosystem and the environment. We've done a lot of damage to this planet, and this is perhaps our last chance to enable this recirculation of people, but to hopefully do so in a sustainable way. So what I want to see is, of course, if people are moving south to north, and if that is even allowed or enabled or tolerated from a humanitarian or an economic or demographic, sort of standpoint by these governments, that they also think about doing so as sustainably as possible, right? So we have to think about the built environment. We have to think about how we collect rainwater and recycle gray water and do more hydroponic agriculture and urban farming, and how we use solar and wind power and all other kinds of renewables and that sort of thing. And again, I think the cities that are going to be the most attractive are the ones that are doing those things. So yes, on the one hand, south to north, but it actually becomes so much more complex. I really foresee a world in which people move a lot more than just once or twice in the course of their lifetime. In the same way that the difference between a baby boomer generation and millennials is, whereas the baby boomers may have had one career, one job over the course of their career, young people may have 4 jobs at the same time. Well, similarly, I imagine that the young generations of today and tomorrow will be a lot more mobile than previous generations.
What happens to these cities that maybe there are outflows of people from that are, maybe not in that northern general band of, or do we just see an era of decay? I mean, there's so much invested in terms of, infrastructure embedded into these urban ecosystems really around, the belt of the Western Hemisphere. And what do you see as the future for these cities?
Well, there are a lot of stranded assets, right, in the world. We have an excess, in a way, of oil pipeline capacity, which hopefully we won't need as much if we transition more rapidly towards renewables, so oil and gas pipelines, and sort of, outmoded infrastructure. Just coastal megacities in areas where sea levels are never really going to rise and inundate some of them, and we see this happening in places like Jakarta and Bangkok and so forth. So already they need to do a lot of planning, not to relocate the entire city, because remember, when we're talking about Asian megacities, you're talking about 25 to 50 million people, not 2 to 5 million people. So it's about building in the new locations and gradually shifting, the kind of urban geography and footprint. And that process is underway. Indonesia is even planning an entirely new capital. I don't think they'll actually build it. But the point is that those are the kind of extremes that we're going to. So yes, there are trillions of dollars of assets that will be stranded, are already, and will continue to be. What I would like to see and what I advocate for is using kind of this complex modeling, these tools that we have at our disposal, to think about and map out where are the survivable geographies, the habitable, welcoming geographies, and to conscientiously relocate populations there, but again, to do so with sustainable infrastructure. And that, I think, is the right model for governments around the world, the private sector as well, to collaborate on. Because we can either become survival societies, where you basically exist just to continue to remain alive, and this is what parts of California have become, parts of the East Coast as well, or we can try to ensure people's continued productivity, not just survival, by doing more premeditated and conscious relocation. So I call this, in the book, I call this pre-design. Pre-design the think about the geographies in advance, and pre-design the very habitats in advance, so that we are actually allowing humans to flourish, not just survive.
What happens as you think about the time scale of this migration and change? And of course, you talk about and acknowledge the migration of humans over centuries, millennia. Is that speed of change as a result of climate change accelerating? Is that one of the dislocations that we're dealing with right now, is the speed of this change?
No question. It's an acceleration in the rate of change, if you will. Remember that the so-called climate niche, right, the stable band of latitudes within which most of the human population lives, has been relatively steady for 10,000 years or so, right? And that's how we developed agricultural and then urban, more sedentary civilization. But prior to that, we were a mostly nomadic species, of course. And I do think that we're going to be quasi-nomadic again until we can determine what those next stable geographies are as the climate niche starts to shift and has been shifting. And we have new geographies of agricultural productivity like Russia and Canada. So inevitably cities will rehabilitate, rejuvenate, or be founded in those geographies. I spent a lot of time in Russia, in Siberia, and these kind of far-flung places. And when I talk to provincial sort of figures and mayors and whatnot, they all say that they actually want larger populations. They want more migrants. They have a lot of infrastructure that they want to build. They're still living on Soviet era infrastructure in a lot of ways. China's projects have not reached, the whole country by any stretch of the imagination. So, but under the radar, actually, even in countries that we think of as being very culturally insular, even xenophobic, certainly nationalist, what's happening under the radar is that they're actually preparing to absorb more people in a climate change world. And let's remember one other thing, is that even if you were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, right? Even if we were to undertake radical geoengineering initiatives, the climate is a complex adaptive system, a complex system. It does not go back to what it was in 1800 or 1900 or 1990, right? It becomes something different, and we have to adapt to it. It is not going to adapt to us.
As you think about that adaptation and architecture, planning of cities, I mean, we've all been historically, as you said, kind of planning in what would be perceived as a relatively stable environment. I mean, what are the changes that we need to make in the planning of our cities as we think about, infrastructure, building new buildings, et cetera, to adapt to this new reality? Is it just about adjusting for temperature, or are there other factors that you think that we should be thinking about from an urban planning perspective?
Well, this is where humankind's ingenuity really shines through, because the more you look into the amazing technological feats and innovations that have already been pioneered, the more faith and confidence you have that we can get through this, even though this is our fault, right? And again, 3D printed, cement-less housing, even mobile infrastructures, movable habitats, right, that can house thousands of people in the event of, again, various climate disasters or even political ones for that matter. The things that we can do with CO2 capture from the air, so again, that's more in the mitigation realm. But the things that we can do, again, with food production in these underground environments, sort of new greenhouses, again, the hydro and aquaponics, aeroponics, and so forth, it's really amazing. So the technology is available already, and it's getting better by the day. Obviously, solar power, renewable power, portable, small-scale nuclear, concentrated solar. It's pretty amazing. And so we can dematerialize to some degree. We can be more mobile and agile and nomadic, while also thriving in a way in terms of our ability to be more locally self-sufficient, without the dependence on very vulnerable or brittle global supply chains. So we can do this, we really can. The question is, can we do it at scale? And we tend to forget that when we're looking at new city projects and new designs that have been, dreamed up by great architects, very often it's a start, right? In new cities, smart cities, they target maybe 10,000 people, 20,000 people, 50,000 people, maybe even 100,000 people. And I've been to dozens of these projects around the world. Let's remember that my concern in this book is 8 billion people, right? 8 billion. And in particular, I'm concerned with the 4 billion young people in the world, to answer the question, where will they go? What is the right place for them to go? And how can we get them there to ensure, again, a flourishing continuity for our species? So that's a tall order. And yes, demonstration projects are phenomenal, and I'm citing the technologies that emerge from them. But we've got to think pretty ambitiously about the scale factor involved here, and that's why this is the great mission of our time. But about those cities, again, I think they'll look quite different. Whenever I see a design for a future city in which there's a looming skyscraper in the middle, I say to myself, why do you need that? And I have a section of the book about this. I'm saying, look, of course, I enjoy going to the top of a really tall tower with my children on my shoulders as much as anyone. But think about what you need for the kind of turbulence and unpredictability that lies ahead. And the answer usually isn't a 180-story building, right? So, I'm more in the mindset and admire more the technologies that are realistic for the world that we are going to inhabit, rather than the one we used to.
So a lot of what you talked about is reflects that choice of location based on that latitude, altitude as we think about climate change. But what about, you also mentioned about attitudes. You mentioned Vancouver and Toronto, where I'm based in Vancouver, and I would argue that a lot of the population migration we've seen here is not so much because of climate change, but because of actually attitudes and the social structure that exists in these cities. I mean, what do you view as think about these 4 billion young people, assuming that we're moving towards more climate friendly environments? But speak about the attitudes in terms of, what do you think these people are looking for from that perspective in a city in the future?
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because this is not an intangible issue. It's a very concrete one. And young people today, millennials, Gen Z, are the most surveyed generation of people in the history of the human species, right? We know everything about them psychologically. We keep ask them questions and poke and prod all day long. We know that their values are sustainability, mobility, connectivity, right? And they are obviously tend to be more liberal. They want to be in tolerant, diverse social settings, right? And they want to allow their identities to flourish and to feel a sense of community, civicism, as the scholar Daniel Bell calls it. So I think we know fairly well what they want. The question is which cities are being smart enough to give it to them. So places like Toronto or Vancouver or Berlin and so forth. And what I write about in the book is all the places that we know and a lot of places we don't know where that's happening. So people aren't aware that there's never been this many foreigners living in Tokyo as right now. We still think of Japan not only as aging, even declining in population, but culturally very insular. But there are about 3 million non-Japanese people living in Japan right now. And they're not there involuntarily, right? They're there because they actually are part of what the future of Japan is. Now, Japan is not going to be a melting pot, right? It's not going to be like Toronto or Dubai any century soon, but it is certainly evolving. And neighborhoods of Tokyo remind you of what the future could look like when you have at that urban scale, because you won't hear about this in the Japanese parliament. You'll see it on the ground in Tokyo, and you'll see it in Fukuoka and other cities where you have young people bustling with their ecosystems for technology and culture and so on. And again, now let's pan back to the country level and the city level. You have a place like Canada, which during the pandemic overtook the United States as in many surveys one of the most desirable expat destinations in the world, or just not even for expats, just desirable destination. Look at what Canada does: a transparent, points-based immigration system. Your pathway toward citizenship begins the day your plane lands. You of course have an affordable educational system. And here's one of the things people look at in the same way you mentioned earlier, that superstar cities are magnetic because of the higher wages. Well, what young people look for when they're looking around the world and saying, where do I want to go? Now that there are 100 countries with nomad visas, whereas there are only 2, when they're looking around the world saying where to go, they're saying, well, where is there a high rate of full-time job creation? Not gig economy jobs, but real full-time jobs, right? Where I can have stability. Canada is one of those places. Japan is one of those places. And this data is available, and I like to see young people looking at it really hard to say, how can they stretch out their runway of savings? How can they be in a place that not only already is tolerant, as if it simply emerges, from the ether, but how they can contribute to a place that's building that future youth-oriented culture. And I give Canada a lot of credit for doing that. And let me add that in the UK, despite Brexit, they come 180 degrees. It is easier today to migrate to the United Kingdom than it was in 2015, right now as we speak. And that's not a kind of conjecture. You no longer need to pay a security bond if you're from a developing country. You no longer need to prove that you have a job offer. They're not requiring those things anymore. They're saying, if you have a college education from wherever, come. We want people to come and just figure it out and contribute and get jobs and pay taxes and invest and rent and consume. Right. And I think that's the realization that's happening across the kind of, northern countries one by one. It's a realization that, we are lucky to be in the habitable geographies, the sustainable, resilient geographies, and yet our populations are declining. This is the ultimate mismatch. This is the greatest irony of this lockdown and the greatest irony of today's human geography, is that the young and the eager and the energetic and the capable are mostly trapped in the places that are becoming less and less livable, whereas the most livable geographies are literally dying off due to old age and low fertility. And we have it, the opportunity of this generation is to correct that mismatch. And in doing so, of course, that will revitalize and rejuvenate our cities.
So as you think about the ideal city, and both in terms of location-based and geography and attitudes and policies, what does that look like? If I were, without naming a particular city, what's your vision of the ideal city of the future?
Well, I'm always happy to name Berlin because I've lived there many times over the last 30 years, and it's like my kind of spiritual home. But there's a lot wrong with Berlin as well in terms of its fiscal management and so on. And it too has an affordable housing crisis of its own political making and that kind of thing. But in terms of a place that has gone from being, a broken Cold War, sort of hot zone to being a place that's more or less by consensus considered to be the coolest city in the world, that's quite a transformation in a 25-year period. But again, I see the merits, and of course, I celebrate diversity. So I see the merits and the uniqueness of so many different places that I travel to. I think about a place like Edinburgh, Scotland, which is, relatively quiet, but incredibly, energetic when you're inside the city in terms of the intellectual culture and intellectual life. So that's an example of a place that people would name as a great global metropolis of the future, and yet it's exactly the kind of place we should see 100 of, ideally across the Northern Hemisphere, rather than only 4 or 5 such cities like Edinburgh, right? And of course, again, it's in a climate propitious zone. It rains a lot in Scotland. They have a lot of fresh water. They're planting a lot of trees and that kind of thing. So ideally, again, we take that model, that role model, and we expand it and replicate it, and we retrofit and improve places to become like that.
Is that really the sort of idealized vision of what the optimistic scenario is, historically over the last 100 years, our economic growth and concentration of population has been, very spiky, where the New Yorks and the Londons of the world have the lion's share of not only their own domestic economy, but a large global share. Is really the future that maybe there's 100 world's best cities in terms of, because as you mentioned, we're talking about 4 billion people. We can't all move to 1, 2, 4 cities. Is it really about looking at how do we create, 100 Berlins, Vancouvers, Edinburghs?
Well, so we've been in this period of transition for a long time. In a way, your question is not at all hypothetical, because the turning point really began 30, 40 years ago already with the rise of Asian economies, obviously breakneck population growth. Remember, the majority of the human population is east of Dubai. The majority of the world economy is east of Dubai. So yes, of course, there is a sort of not suspended animation, but inertia to the global role of places like London and New York and Los Angeles. And long may they preserve that role by way of being connected to each other and to the new growth centers, by way of nonstop flights, by way of fiber optic internet cables, by way of stock exchanges being linked. That's part of what keeps these cities great, let's not forget. It's not just that they remain cemented where they are and people go there. They are connecting to the new growth centers. And of course, those new growth centers and those already now established global cities like Shanghai, like Singapore, like Dubai, those, some would say Istanbul also, weren't on people's radars to the extent that they are today 20 years ago. So we've already been going through a very dynamic phase where you have not 1, 2, or 3, but 9, 10, or 11, legitimate, true global hubs. And you and I have been fortunate enough to witness that. Many of us, many people, I know, we're in Shenzhen 40 years ago and now go back. We're in Shanghai 30 years ago and now look at it. I spent my childhood in Dubai. Now look at it, right? So I can literally, recall. And so we have been seeing that. And you see the beautification of a city like Moscow, right? And you see the transformation of a place like Berlin. So we're not just making a future forecast, we're watching it happen in real time. I have some stories in the book from places like Almaty, Kazakhstan. Almaty is a very fast-growing city. It's an alpine oasis right at the foot of the Tian Shan Mountains. It's certainly a climate oasis area. It's a thriving, fast-growing country, definitely absorbing more and more people. Its population has grown faster than any of the former Soviet republics. Its economy is reformed. So I go there a lot anyway, but I spend time in the book kind of walking you through how you take a small dust bowl, right, that, of post-Soviet backwater town, and how do you make it into a real cosmopolitan hub for the steppe lands of Central Asia? That is not just for Kazakhs, it's literally a multinational hub today. And there's plenty of places working hard to become like that. Baku, Tbilisi, cities in the Caucasus, and on the list goes. And I love to see that exertion of effort. I mentioned again some of the Russian cities that are off the beaten track right now. But I go to these places precisely because I see the nose to the grindstone, them saying, we want to be the next Paris, right? Now, may or may not become the next Paris, but that's the way to think. And I absolutely applaud that. And I love to participate in the journey with them.
So as you think about our world's best cities rankings, and we're looking at the cities that are at the top of the list, the Londons, New York, Paris, and we have seen cities like, Dubai, move up into the top 10. What do you think if we look at more preparing these rankings 10, 20 years from now? I mean, what would be your guess at some of the cities that we'll see kind of rising up into the top 10? Does it look still largely the same as it does today? Or do you see some of these other cities really emerging in the next decade or two into that world-class status?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, it does take time. We've just been talking about the last 40 years, right, in one sweep. So somewhere along the way, each of these new places that weren't on the list before, like a Singapore, Dubai, and so forth, made their way on the list and are climbing up the list, and are certainly, again, you see the effort. I live in Singapore. I see the constant, conviction that they can do better and become a smarter and smarter city. You see the exact same thing in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And again, that's happening. You can imagine eventually places like Istanbul, trying to clean up their act in more ways than one, and to be more sustainable in terms of the density and the urban planning and the affordable housing and that sort of stuff. You can see that effort, underway. I mentioned Moscow earlier as well. Really remarkable, again, the transformation there. They have a great mayor who is actually doing a lot for affordable housing, and it's obviously, again, a very propitious geography. So again, with a greater population, which of course it requires, you can imagine it climbing its way onto that list. I have put up these maps sometimes online where I say, here are the 8 top cities in the world as ranked by whomever. I say, which city is next? Cast your vote. And of course, it never works out and is a very fair kind of poll, because everyone just names the city they're in. Someone will vote for Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo or Tehran or whatever the case may be. But what's good about the ranking you do, is that you're holistic in your methodology, right? It takes more than just being big or rich, right? I mean, there's a quality of life factor. And again, in a world where people, especially young people, can increasingly be anywhere because governments are reforming their immigration policies, changing the rules, realizing they need to attract young people, that's going to create a war for talent. Much of the book really is about the war for talent for young people and what countries will have to do to win that war. Because if you don't have that liberal, diverse culture, right? If you don't have the affordable housing, if you don't have free, ubiquitous Wi-Fi, if you don't have good health care, and on and on and on, why would a young person come to your country or your city when they can just go to places that are doing that? And that's part of the competition. The war for talent is actually a war between cities to become the most amenable place for talent to go. So, we've talked about many, many, many cities in this conversation. I definitely think that, if you look at Berlin, right? So, its population has only just returned to the population that it had in about 1930, right? So it's taken 100 years almost to get the population back to 3.5 million people. Obviously, there are many intervening, political variables in that particular city's story in terms of World War II and everything else. But so remember, though, here's a final point that's worth reflecting on that speaks to this war for talent. The world population, as you know, Chris, is starting to plateau, right? So we're not really talking about an infinitely growing and an exponentially growing population as we had in the 20th century and a Malthusian crisis of overpopulation, right? To the contrary, we're leveling off maybe 8.5, probably below 9 billion people. With yes, high life expectancy, but baby boomer mortality is coming around the corner through the 2020s and 2030s, and young people are not having children. You know, fertility is very, very low in the next generation. So we're talking about, again, the core demographic that I think is the most important is the 4 billion people today who are millennials and Gen Z and and Gen Alpha. And basically the future of our of humankind is literally those 4 billion people of today as they get older, and where they decide to go literally determines the winners and the losers of the 21st century, right? It doesn't require esoteric econometrics to know the winners and the losers of the 21st century. You need to know where these 4 billion people are going. And again, I think what is exciting about what you're doing and what cities have to learn from each other is how to attract those 4 billion people. That's it. That is my open and shut case for what we need to be doing, what we need to be focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And I think that, that really is the premise behind the world's best city rankings and this World City Festival, and bringing together all of these thoughts and minds and insights from around the world together to talk about specifically that. And as we move into this sort of leveling off period, as you call it, that's going to force, a lot more competition and innovation between cities. And I hope the result of that is what you talked about of that we'll see 100 Berlins or Vancouvers or Torontos or Singapores, and it won't just be that a few cities win and a lot of cities lose, that we'll see a lot of cities, kind of rise up into being those best cities. Well, thanks so much for having us. I'm looking forward to reading your book now that it's out and available. So for all of you interested in learning more, Move is available everywhere as of now and just come out. And we look forward to reading that and catching up with you, hopefully in person somewhere in the world in the near future, Parag. Thanks for joining us.
I hope so too. Thanks so much, Chris.
Take care.